So today we're going to talk about art, media, sports, but I want to frame this for you to begin with by recalling our chapter on linguistic anthropology. In that, when I was talking about languages and forms of expression, we covered things like verbal communication, how to analyze that, but we also talked about things like nonverbal communication, behaviors, mannerisms, and that sort of thing. Well, frankly, our discussion of arts and cultural expressions are sort of a rehash of that a little bit. But let's face it, when you come to a discipline like anthropology, many people think of arts and music and dancing and clothing styles and jewelry and hairstyles and these sorts of things. That's what many people think culture is. And they're not necessarily wrong. But it's a continuum of expressions and communications that brings us back to our discussion in chapter 13 about theories of anthropology, so how we make sense of cultures. And I've said before that there's a sort of a continuous loop, that culture is never something that is static and stands still. It's constantly being reinvented, that you didn't choose where you were born into or where you grew up in, but you learned the rules of the culture that you found yourself in. That's acculturation, that's enculturation, and that is how you learn how to even think, how you communicate in your own mind, how you formulate ideas and thoughts and concepts is in part based on how you were trained to do so. So you're never really free from your own cultural biases, from your own cultural framework. But at the same time, you're an individual and you participate in that culture and you help to perpetuate it and build it or to go against it and tear it down. That can be done through language. That can be done through communication. So you are receiving inputs on how to think about culture from when you were a little child, but you also are participating in that culture through your expressions, through the way you communicate and talk to other people. And so that's where culture is never a fixed entity. It's a constantly evolving loop of inputs going into your mind and communication coming out of yourself. And then that contributes to the general culture that then you recycle back into your brain and then you communicate again. And it's constantly moving. So we've looked at that already in terms of language, but all forms of expression fit into this continuum. Some of them are very precise, like words and communication through language can be very precise about what it is that you're trying to demonstrate. Some forms of communication can be less literal, less obvious, and less precise, but not necessarily less powerful because of that. So we're going to talk broadly about art, but I want you to think of art and cultural expressions as part of the same continuum as we were talking about with language as well. Art is difficult to define, as many terms are. And we use it in a particular way, that word art, in our own culture in a specific cultural setting. But as we're going to break down, the way we look at art is not necessarily the way that everybody else looks at art, people in other cultures. So once again, you've got to put on your cultural relativistic hat and you've got to sort of take apart what art does in a society and what it represents. It's slightly ethnocentric. It's slightly wrong to think of representations that we would call art as representing what a culture is in essence, because there is no snapshot image of a culture. So, for instance, People that I talk to, like my parents, for instance, when they go traveling places, they don't like seeing imagery that they're familiar with in their own lives. They don't like that cross-cultural contamination. They want to see a pure idea of a culture in its pristine state. But the fact of the matter is nothing like that actually really exists. Seeing a McDonald's in Germany doesn't make it less Germany. It just means that the global world has incorporated images, symbols, and practices into a tapestry that those threads are woven into what modern Germany is like. You can't go back in time to capture a pure German town from 100 years ago. So my parents will be disappointed. But we can think of lots of cultural expressions that way, is that we shouldn't encapsulate art by our own terms. We can ethically describe it as an anthropologist, but we then also have to see how art functions as a part of society from an emic perspective. How do the people that participate in that culture use art and cultural expressions to form identities and form their culture and communicate with one another? So art has many different definitions as a consequence of this. But I think a pretty fair way to describe art is expressive culture of some sort. So poetry is art. Even though it's using words, it's expressive culture. Painting is expressive culture, even though it doesn't use words. It is expressive and it can communicate ideas and images and cultural information from brain to brain. And this can be done in all sorts of different media, things like dance, music, songs, painting, poetry, sculpture, pottery, textiles, telling stories, prose or verse, dramas, and comedies. There's so many different ways art can be expressed. It's sort of the stuff of culture. And so it's a big topic, but what this chapter is not really setting out to do is to tell you about every single thing that every culture does, right? That's the work of what an ethnographer does, is they calculate and they record and they gather data on what the stuff of culture is, art and cultural expressions, the way people communicate with one another. We don't have the time in an introductory course to be able to cover even a single culture's vast array of art. But what we can do is go through the terminology and how an anthropologist would approach any culture. So, the first thing that we need to do is define what art is, and that, as I said, is difficult to do. But it's a manifestation of human creativity. It's so when people are trying to create things, and that creation comes in part from the way they've been enculturated into the culture from which they came. Even if you're rebelling against it, even someone who is counterculture, they came from a culture and they're responding to it. So their cultural expressions, their creativity is coming from a place of knowledge of that culture. Now, the qualities that are a part of this expressive culture, this manifestation of creativity, can be perceived by others. It is perceived by others. And this perception in art, if we want to use that word, is referred to as aesthetics. Aesthetics doesn't necessarily mean it has to be pretty. You can find things aesthetically pleasing, and you perceive it through the senses, but aesthetics can also refer to things that you dislike or you find upsetting or challenging. We in the West, in our culture, tend to compartmentalize where art is found, what art is, and who does art. But that is not universal. While cultural expression is an absolute universal, communication is something every human does. The way that art is found and produced and received varies from place to place. And we in our culture tend to have specific locations for art and specific people who do art, but that is not a universal. So the Western culture, coming from Europe and even things like Greek and Roman traditions, tend to make a distinction between the extraordinary and the ordinary. That is to say, the artistic or sacred objects and the secular. And so for a long time, Western cultures have had specific venues for where art is contained. And a lot of times that was in religious venues. A lot of artists needed, if you wanted to be a full-time specialized artist, you needed somebody to support you. You needed, if this was your job, and all art is work of some sort, if you're doing art, you're not doing something else. You're not doing a job that has a more functional purpose. So you need to be sponsored in some way. And for a long time, it was the church who had the most resources to be able to fund art and artists, which means that a lot of art was found in religious venues. And so museums, churches, temples, these are the sorts of formal venues where religion in Western traditions tends to be found. And that, because it's found in that area, art is seen as sacred and separate from normal, secular, everyday life, the sacred and the profane. But art and even religion can have expressions in informal locations as well, in parks, in your home, in gathering places. And the venues of expression of artistic expressions of culture can be found in many different places. And because of this clear separation that the West tends to have between the venues for art and religion and the venues for secular and mundane, we have for a long time wrongly assumed that when you have artistic expressions, it must be a sacred object. So when early anthropologists were going into places that they were unfamiliar with, and they saw artistic objects, objects that had no practical function, this is often described as ritual or religious or spiritual. That's not necessarily the case. But the same is also true the other way around. Things that have a practical function aren't necessarily not artistic and are not necessarily not sacred. So just because we have this separation between these two, where art and cultural expressions and religious and spiritual expressions take place, that doesn't mean that that's a universal either. So it's important to remember, though, that where you find art, where you find expressive culture, is also adds value and meaning to what is being expressed. So it's a sculpture in a park might get something from the fact that it is in nature, it's outdoors. Whereas if you were to take stuff from your garbage can and mount it into a frame and put it behind and put glass in front of it, hang it on a wall, that garbage behind glass, if you hung it in a museum or a gallery, it could possibly be art. So garbage can be art in one venue, where garbage out in a park is not necessarily considered to be art. So placement provides a means of distinguishing whether what we're looking at is art or cultural expression at all. And this highlights something that is important to the meaning of what art is. There is often some kind of either intentionality on behalf of the artist, but certainly there must be some kind of a meaning derived from the art for the person perceiving that art. So, for instance, if I were to scribble some lines on a piece of paper just with the intention of thinking, I just want to be an explosion of color on a page and take some crayons and scribble them all over the place, I was intending for someone to look at that, and that is maybe not great art, but it's art, because I intended for some message to be conveyed. But it's another question as to whether, if I were to give these crayons to a chimpanzee or a raccoon, let's say, who scribbles onto a page, is that art, or is it just an accidental splash of colors? Well, this is where the meaning for the person perceiving that is also important as well. Even though I would argue that a chimpanzee or a raccoon cannot create art because they don't have the intentionality there, it might be perceived as artistic by the receptor. And then it becomes part of that culture. Once you receive that, you're entering that into your brain, and you are using that to form the way you understand culture, which will then impact the way that you communicate culture in the future. So what is art is in part intentionality, but there was I'm asking you this question about, or I'm posing this question about what art is for a specific meaning, because in the West, once again, because we have these compartmentalized venues for where art is, state societies like our own with strict hierarchies tend to have a class of people whose job it is to influence what is considered art and what is not. So these are critics and judges and experts. They'll tell you whether it's art or not, because we actually have a very regimented and compartmentalized culture in a state society, and so we outsource the determination of whether something is art or good art, and we'll come to this in a moment, high art or folk art or low art at another time. But a lot of contemporary art challenges this notion, especially in Western societies and state societies. Andy Warhol, whether you like his art or not, he challenged the boundaries that we have between what is art and what is not art by doing something like I mentioned before, putting garbage behind in a frame and behind glass and hanging it in a museum. He didn't do that exactly, but the idea of challenging that boundary of what do we call art is something that he was very engaged in, and he founded what many called pop art. His paintings of Campbell soup cans. If any of you are at all artistically inclined, you could probably duplicate what he did. But the thing is you didn't. He did it. It was from his intentionality to show that it doesn't have to be a masterpiece for us to call it art. And for that reason, a lot of contemporary art is challenging these boundaries, trying to break down the divisions between art, what is considered art and what is not, challenging the critics, the judges, the experts that determine what is art and what is good art. And for that, there's value in that as expressive culture, whether or not you like the aesthetic values of an Andy Warhol painting or not. So the opposite of this is also true. So challenging the boundaries of what is art in a compartmentalized culture like our own state society, in non-state societies, we should also keep in mind that things that we would consider artistic are not necessarily made for aesthetic reasons, but maybe for some other purpose. So your book mentions the Kalabari of southern Nigeria, where they carve particular types of wooden sculptures, but they're not to look pretty. They're not to hang in a gallery, even though Westerners have gone into Nigeria and collected these things, hang them on their walls or in galleries as artworks. But they're not intended to be made for that purpose. They're intended to be in a house and be in someone's household and be a residence for the spirits that are supposed to reside in those sculptures. So it's a religious but also functional object that serves a particular purpose, but not just art. So this is where our misconceptions of these compartmentalizations, that art is for a gallery and a museum and functional is for outside of that, that breaks down, and we have to actually when we go to different cultures, and we have to use our cultural relativistic hat to try and determine the emic purpose of what we might call art in that particular society. Who is an artist? Well, this varies as well. Going back to our chapters on economics and politics, if you have a foraging society, you don't have specialized labor. You don't have division of labor. Everybody does the same thing as the next person. Everybody hunts, everybody gathers, everybody makes fire, and everybody skins animals, and everybody makes clothes and basketry and that sort of thing. These are all of these tasks are shared, but everyone also has free time, which means that everyone's free time can be spent doing art, which means that in certain types of economies and certain types of political organizations, you don't have full-time specialized artists. You have art that is done by individuals. But the degree to which artists can be separated from or interlinked with their work varies cross-culturally. So some cultures, art is very individualistic. It's about that person. I am carving an effigy of my spirit animal or something like that. Or maybe it's just a pattern that you're drawing, that everybody draws, that is representative of your communal identity. So the individuals who do art is not universal as well, and needs to be understood in the